Hi, everyone. My name is Juan, and I am part of the International Telecommunication Union, or the ITU, the United Nations Specialized Agency for Information and Communication Technologies. I'm here to host the AI for Good Let's Talk, which is part of the AI for Good Global Summit's programming, our United Nations leading platform to scale AI to achieve and accelerate the Sustainable Development Goals. The AI for Good Let's Talk is a series of fireside chats dedicated to discussing AI, the human experience, and our quest to build a better world. We do a lot of very different things. We talk about smart mobility, smart cities, art, digital humans, post-humanism, what have you. And today's topic in particular will be very interesting in the context of the big picture of where AI fits in our society. So I just want to let you know that actually this conversation is live. So all of this is not coming from a script. I'm really talking to you in person. And if you're interested in being part of this conversation, please feel free to do so. My Padawan Melissa will be monitoring our social media channels and making sure that your comments and your voices are heard as part of this discussion. So why don't we say hi to her really quickly? Hi, Melissa. How's it going?
Hello. Good, thanks. Very excited to see all the questions come through.
Yeah, you look like you're very excited right now.
I am.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Okay, great. So today's AI for Good Let's Talk. We will connect with Jérôme Duberry from the Albert Hirschman Centre on Democracy at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. Today's talk, we will be discussing how we can explore the promise of AI applications for civil society participation in the policymaking processes at the national and international levels. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Jérôme to be online. Hi, how's it going?
Hi, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here. Very honored as well. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Yeah, it's good to see you. So just for everyone, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what your work is? Because it's been actually quite fascinating reading.
I started a couple of years ago with a PhD on the digitalization of a decision-making process in an environmental organization, IUCN. It's a global organization based with headquarters in Geneva. And I looked at how digital technology, fostered the participation of civil society organizations in this multi-stakeholder decision-making process. And then I moved on to AI and blockchain and how these emerging technologies are used by still civil society actors and NGOs in global environmental governance. For example, to find solutions to biodiversity conservation, for example, or new funding opportunities, or nudging citizens to have a better, more sustainable behavior. And more recently, I worked on, and I'm still working on that, on AI promises for democracy. There is a lot written about and a lot of research ongoing about the challenges of AI for democracy, but for liberal democracy. But there's not so much done about the promises of AI for democracy. And I think both are important, so that's what we're working on.
Yeah, no, that's very exciting to hear. I think that's an interesting counterbalance, essentially, to the narrative of AI. When we talk about AI, especially during the early days, we talk about it from a perspective of technology being an existential threat. When you look at the way that technology and even like robots or AI, even back in the 1950s, is perceived, we always see as the other. And I'm very curious as to why you're particularly interested in the positive benefits of AI and the promises that it brings to governance.
Yeah, it all started really with a call for project that was done by an MIT professor 2 years ago, I think. And he basically asked us to think about the future of democracy. And he said, there is more and more AI in our everyday life, including in politics. So why don't we start now thinking about how it will impact democracy in the future, because we can still actually, have an impact on it. Whereas if we wait too long, then it will be other actors who will design it and according to their own values and interests, which is logical. And so that's where the idea comes from. And I must say that at the very beginning, when I suggested this idea to some of my colleagues, they all looked at me like I was a little bit crazy because it was way too disruptive. In particular, the idea of saying that one day we'll be replacing our vote with a digital self or a digital twin powered by AI, which can vote on our behalf. And they were like, no, but this is impossible. This is the end of democracy. And my question was, but why? Why is this the end of democracy? I'm not saying that we need to go in that direction. I'm not saying that we need to replace people with digital twins who can vote on our behalf. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying maybe this is going to happen, and therefore let's think about it. What does this mean? And I think that AI is super interesting in a sense that it pushes us to actually think about these ground questions, such as what does it mean to vote? And it forces us to think about this, about our agency. Why do we vote, and why is it important to vote? If it's just a question of efficiency, and if it's just the necessity to have the view of everybody, then actually a digital self that is reliable, of course, could give the opportunity to policymakers and governmental leaders to have the view of everybody at the same time. So when we and I'll stop here because you may have some questions, but when we look at traditional participation, and we look at who is participating today in elections, in traditional political processes such as election, referendums, and so on, it's usually the wealthiest and the most educated part of the population. So AI and the idea of a digital twin who could replicate our votes could actually solve that question, because everybody could have a say in the policymaking processes automatically, in a way, and the idea of this digital twin would be, for example, that this digital twin is not for now, it could be for the future. It's for the future. But if we take the assumption that it's reliable, it could be designed, for example, by a public entity or ITU, for example. But the question is, you can always unplug it. You can always correct the voting of your digital twin, so you still have the agency, but actually there are many decisions that, they're not so important for you. If you have a digital twin that could actually vote on your behalf, then why not? And so that's the idea. And that's why we're looking at all these promises. This is just maybe the most provocative one. There are many others. And AI is already used in politics by governments. So that's the important thing to say. And so our research, and we have now an ongoing citizen consultation ongoing in Geneva, the idea is also to raise awareness about it. There is already some AI done and used for citizen participation.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. Sorry, Melissa, were you going to say something, or? Oh, okay. No,
Go ahead.
Okay, great. We're very respectful here. So, yeah, one of the things I think that's really interesting about this that you bring up is the whole idea of democracies being under threat by technology. Democracy as a idea as a concept has existed way before any of us, really, and it's always been in some ways reactive. The way we approach democracies has always been reactive to kind of the external factors like technology, right? Like I think especially if you give the context of voting now, it does put somewhat of an existential, well, you could say it's an existential threat to the system, just because if we try to implement existing technology for voting, who's to say whether or not it makes sense at this point in time? Now there's a bit of a debate around that, right? And I think it's really important to show the role that technology plays in terms of safeguarding and maintaining the judicial process. I think my question here, sorry, I know I went through a big context there. I think the question here that I think is interesting when you bring up digital twins is that how can you safeguard the validity of the data that twin represents, right? Like I think you could say that if I had the digital twin, I could potentially vote for one referendum that I may not necessarily approve upon. Is there a big threat in being able to implement that at this point in time?
Yeah, it's true that we take in this research, we project ourselves into the future. So we take for granted that actually we'll have the AI capacity to have a digital self that is very reliable. and that will take into consideration our changes and change of mind and change of views and change of opinion. And what we're trying to figure out is, what if we have this? Then what does it mean to vote? So we're not so much focusing on how can we have a very reliable digital twin or digital self that could vote on our behalf, because we're not computer scientists, but we're trying to think, okay, what if we have that? Then what does this mean? What is the purpose of voting? Because maybe voting is more than just a very utilitarian approach where, okay, you need to cast your vote and you need to have a say, and the government wants you to have a say so that they can legitimize the whole process and their activities and actions. But maybe it's more than that. Maybe voting is actually making together, building a community, making sense together. And so if there is more than that, then AI is actually forcing us to think about what is behind or under voting, and what are the different missions and purposes of voting, and how can we adapt or imagine what these missions and objectives of voting can be adapted to the future. Because maybe voting as we know it today should change. And when we look at the decline in political participation, because some people say that actually they don't feel represented by the government and so on, and there are many complaints about it, and we see how the youth participate. The youth participates through Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion. They go on the street and they do things as well, much more than actually voting.
Yeah.
So how can we adapt all of this for the future of voting? That's the question we're asking.
It's funny you mentioned that, because when you're saying the youth go out and protest, I was just thinking, I'm young. I grew up on punk rock. I'm very much into a rational protest mentality, of course, myself. I think but you do have to bring up a very interesting point about voting participation, and I kind of want to try to dig into that a little bit, because I think there's an interesting kernel there. One thing that's fascinating about this is, in the future, the idea would be that we would all have a digital twin. But the challenge of developing and finding the data, collecting the data even for digital twins, maybe for everyone, is immense, right? I think, you go to somewhere like, I guess India would be a good example, where, or the Philippines, for example, where I think people know how the internet works, but they don't really know how to make careful and informed decisions about how the technology impacts them. And I'm very curious about your perspective on that. How do you take that into account when you do your research?
Yes, it's true that there are two questions here, I think. The first one is data. How do we get the data to actually fuel these digital twins or digital selves? And I don't think that this is problematic today, because I think that we have already today enough data to do that, because there's so much data collected by different actors. Of course, we think of online platforms, but also other data brokers and so on. So there is so much data already available that I'm not sure that data is really the problem. The wealth of data or the availability of data. Of course, there is a question behind of privacy, of ethics, and how can you use the data, what for, and the consent given. The GDPR is a great advance, for example, in that respect, but it's not satisfactory. At least not to my view. Consent is not enough. As you said. What does it mean to consent when you're not really sure what you're consenting to, because you don't have necessarily the literacy or the skills of the education to know exactly how my data is used and what for. And so I completely agree with you. I think that there is the second part of your question should indeed look into education and training. And there, what we see is clearly a bias and some form of discrimination. We have many examples. The famous report of UNESCO, "I Blush If I Could," that talked about all the different forms of discrimination, in particular against women in AI. So I think that there is a lot of work that needs to be done, especially if we consider such crucial use of AI in co-designing the technology. And here I would consider, for example, all the work done by the Design Justice Network, which is this network of scholars and experts, and I completely agree and really like what they do. They try to develop practices, not only technology, but practices to develop the technologies that benefit to all, and not only to a part of the population. And so they basically ask, who designed the technology, who is harmed by the technology, and who benefits from the technology. And very often, it's always the same who are harmed and who benefit. I mean, they're different groups of the population, of course, but they're often the same. So marginalized populations, so on. And so that would be my answer. I think that you see, when we consider, for example, digital twins, it raises not only the question about what we do with it and what it means for democracy, but it also raises the question of how do we develop that and who develops this? Is it all of us? I think that if citizens are involved in through participatory processes, and here you have all the line of research of, for example, participatory action research that involves people and raises awareness or develops their skills through the research and the development of processes. I think that this is exactly what we need to do. With AI, there's always the problem of trust. I'll take one example. I was talking with a representative from the EU Commission, and he was talking to me about Futurium, which is their e-participation platform. And when they do a citizen consultation, they receive over 500,000 comments. And so how do they analyze these comments? They don't have the capacity to actually go through every comment and aggregate these comments and then make a report. So they need to use an AI to actually aggregate the opinion and define some trends and identify some trends in these opinions. The problem that they have is then how do they link and how do they show transparently, in a transparent way, the link between the comment and the final report and the trends. And I think that, what we know about this is that showing the code is not enough, because the code doesn't mean much to people. However, if we were to design this process with citizens together, I think that this would raise a lot the ownership of the process and of the AI. And at the same time, it would raise awareness about this process and the skills. And so I think that we're more and more in this, and I think that that's also exactly what you're doing. It's not only to raise awareness, but it's also to go one step further and to include people in the making of the technology. And this way, you're not only, telling them, okay, this is how it goes, what do you think? But you invite them from the very beginning of the process to the end.
Nice. So I actually have a question. You mentioned in the beginning that AI in the context of democracy is being involved in nudging, and that's a human behavioral economy term. Can you elaborate on that?
Can you ask me again the question?
Yeah. So in the beginning, you mentioned that nudging was being involved. Could you elaborate how that's developing and what kind of ideas are coming out of that space?
this is linked to the research I've done before. And you have some examples of blockchain, for example, being used to nudge citizens. So there, I'll give you two examples. The first one is for sustainable development and sustainable behavior. So yes, there are some initiatives that are done to nudge citizens to adopt a specific behavior, and I don't know if everybody's aware with or knows nudging, but nudging is this concept that basically describes all the incentives that we put in place to actually gently, push people to do a behavior, a positive behavior. And a typical example is when you have a street with a very steep curve, then you put the line on the street for cars to slow down, but actually you don't put them at the same distance one from the other. The closer to the curve, the closer you put the lines, so that people have the impression that they go much faster than they actually go, and instinctively they slow down. So it's to prevent them from having an accident or making an accident. And so the same applies to, for example, sustainable behavior. If you have to choose between, not recycling and recycling, an option would be to give you a really minimal amount of money or minimal value that actually doesn't represent much, but still you get something, you value your positive behavior. So every time you recycle, you would get a tiny cryptocurrency that would then you could use it, I don't know, to protect environmental projects or just to change into some currencies. But the idea is not so much to give you money, but to actually value your behavior and give you this kind of compensation in the form of a cryptocurrency. So that's one example. The other example for AI, which is a little bit more futuristic, but that's something that is looked into at the moment, is to overcome the biases and the cognitive biases. So we all have cognitive biases, and these are automatic ways of thinking. So we tend to have a confirmation bias, for example, a bias that makes us kind of tweak the reality according to our views. And so an idea here would be to use AI to actually collect information and data and flag information to overcome our bias. And so information that we would probably want or we would probably disregard. And so AI, knowing our cognitive bias, would actually flag it and say, hey, it's not that you have to change your mind, but you need to take that into consideration as well. So it would be to improve the fact that citizens are well-informed or make well-informed decisions, which is the basis of democracy.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And I think the question, going back to kind of like your work really, is what are the other promises of AI applications that you see happening or can happen? I think we talked about voting, we talked about data, digital twins. Is there more in the future that can help us accelerate our goals to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals in the future?
Well, I think that in terms of democracy, in a democracy, at a national level, we have some examples of AI being used today already, and some successful examples. For example, in Brazil, the Congress, Brazilian Congress is now using an AI called Rosie, and this AI is checking all the requests for reimbursement of the deputies and the parliamentarians in Brazil. And so they submit their bill, and it's the AI that verifies this bill. It's not, beforehand, they had people who would verify this, and it would be paper-based. And even if not paper-based, it would be impossible to verify everything. And so they would do some random check. But of course, a large part would go unchecked. And so by having an AI capacity to actually verify absolutely everything, then it changes the behavior. And it's a form of nudging as well, because it changes automatically the behavior of people, because they know that they will be checked. So they will not submit a reimbursement unless it corresponds to the clear criteria done by or decided by the Congress. And so, I mean, this is a very, very positive example of how AI can be used as complementary to human capacity. And here we can see that it would be impossible for human beings to do that, because there are too many, there would be too many receipts to check. And so this is a very smart way to use AI. It's a way that also changes the behavior of people. Now, in terms of as well other examples, we have AI that is used to, for example, to design models and scenarios. And so you design a model of the city of Geneva and the traffic in Geneva, and then you can test different, scenarios. I close this street, I build a tram here, and then it allows you to actually see how this will impact other conditions according to your first set of criteria. So it's quite a positive way as well to use AI. A lot of AI is used as well, as I mentioned before, to analyze comments on civic tech platforms. If you have hundreds of thousands of comments, you need to have an AI. So AI is used for that. Also to do some opinion mining and sentiment analysis on social media platforms, so to aggregate the comments. So for political leaders, it's quite useful to know what the population thinks, for example, around a hashtag, or to identify maybe new needs and to know better the population. And we can also see in the future, maybe a bit more, how if each individual has a digital twin, how the government can actually test their policy ideas with all these digital twins live. So every time they have a new idea or they start a new process, then they can check if citizens would agree or not with these digital twins. So that would be an idea. And yeah, and I think that's the main uses today at the national level.
No, that's fantastic, and no, thank you so much for that. That's a lot of information to process, and I think we're almost running out of time. So what I would suggest, actually, as a last question, is maybe for your ideal vision for the future, for the promises that hopefully we can achieve. Do you think what would your timeline be for us to be able to achieve them?
Timeline in terms of in how many years, or in terms of what?
In how many years? Sure. Where do you see us being? Where do you see us being in order to achieve this, like the ideal vision?
I really don't know. I think that it's I can't remember the former head of Microsoft, Bill Gates.
Oh.
Bill Gates, he said a couple of years ago, he said, we're very good at exaggerating the impact of a technology at the short term, but we're very bad at assessing its impact in the mid and long term. And I completely agree with that. So I would say, I don't know. I think that would be my best answer.
No problem at all. Yeah, but it's good to know. I mean, there is some uncertainty with regards to technology, but hopefully we can take it one step at a time, which it seems like we're already doing. So,
yeah, definitely. And in a co-designing approach, I think that's the best thing to do.
Agreed. Totally agreed. But yeah, so thanks so much. We are going to wrap up. And Melissa is going to tell us a little bit more about what's coming up next for AI for Good. So Jérôme, I'll see you in a sec.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your invitation.
No, it's been great. But yeah, so Melissa, AI for Good is more than just a summit. We are a leading platform for discussions on AI to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And we definitely have a lot of things coming up. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what's happening next week?
Thanks, Juan. And thank you to everyone who joined us for this week's On The Go Let's Talk. As always, we have more exciting content coming your way. Next week, we are joined by World Cup winning goalkeeper and UNDP Goodwill Ambassador Iker Casillas and CEO and co-founder of Eindhoven, Manuel Marina Breze, where they will be exploring current and future benefits of wearable AI, data, and telemedicine. And after an incredible turnout of the first workshop, we invite you to part 2 of the satellite data analysis and machine learning classification with QGIS. We also have another On The Go Let's Talk session with senior researcher at NEC Laboratories Europe, Gürkan Salmez, on smart cities, smart mobility, exploring AI for future communities. And finally, we've launched our YouTube channel where you can watch all AI for Good content on demand at the best time that suits you. Thanks very much, and back up to you, Juan.
Thanks, Melissa. So if you're interested in any of these things, you can follow us on our social media channels. I'll put them up over here if you're so inclined. We have a Twitter, we have an Instagram, we do have a LinkedIn. We did not put that in here right now. And we definitely have, as Melissa said, a YouTube channel. So if you're interested in that as well, we do have our content for almost all our programming available online, always, all year, always online, on the go with AI for Good. So again, for all the stuff, all you need for AI for Good and for AI applications to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, please join us for any of our sessions, but especially join us next week, when we discuss smart cities and smart mobility with Gürkan Salmez. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you soon.